Welcome to another video. In this, we'll be looking into the real estate of the chessboard. In other words, you're going to find a way to differentiate between the squares when you look at things from different perspectives. Let's get started. I've shaded 4 squares in black. What's common between them? Take a moment to think about it. Let's apply the principle of fluid intelligence to see if it can help us even more. So what is the principle of fluid intelligence? Finding the similarities between different things and differences between similar things. Now, they're all squares on the chessboard, but these 4 are different than the rest of them. A chessboard, as you know, has 64 squares. These 4 squares that are marked in black are different than the remaining 60. These 4 squares is what we call as the corners. So what is it about these corners? So even before you can place a chess piece, you can think of it in terms of how many adjacent squares are there. And as you can see, the speciality of the corner is that there are only 3 adjacent squares to each corner. I've marked 4 more squares in red. What's common between these 4 shaded squares? And if you go by the same logic of how many squares around each of these red squares, that's 5 in number. And these are what we call as the edges. I've marked 4 more in green. What's common between these 4 squares? Again, apply the same perspective of the number of squares around it. And this is what I call the middle, because there are 8 squares around each one of them. So now if you would color all of this in these 3 shades, black for corners, red for edges, and green for the squares in the middle, then this is how the layout of the chessboard should look. You have 4 corners and 4 edges, a lot of edges, and the rest of it is what we call as a middle. So the question you should be asking is, what's the most valuable square here? You can delve a little deeper and ask, how many corners are there, how many edges are there, and how many squares in the middle? Thinking about all of this can give you a lot of insights into how things work in the game of chess. For example, if I look at it from the perspective of a checkmate, and if you can leverage the board real estate, just looking at these different colors, then you can know that the king in the corner is easier to checkmate than one in the middle. Right? So why? Because checkmate is nothing but controlling the squares around the king. A king in the corner just needs 3 squares that needs to be controlled. The king in the middle, you need to think about 8 squares around it. So it's obviously easier to checkmate a king in the corner than in the edge, than in the middle. The goal of checkmating should be to push the king to the edge of the corner. Now, most of you would have learned how to checkmate with a lone king and queen against a king. And probably you just learned it because somebody showed you how to do it. But when you think of it from the perspective of leveraging the board real estate, then you can actually derive your own method. Because the goal is to push the king to the edge of the corner. Now, the things you can think about or ruminate is, why are the center squares e4, d4, e5, d5 considered to be the most important valuable squares in the chessboard? If you have ideas about this, if you know why this is so, thinking from the first principles, then please share your ideas and thoughts in the comments. Now, what we saw was the perspective of the king. But what if you look at it from the perspective of the knight? For example, in each of the 4 corner squares, you know that the knight can move to 2 different squares. So the freedom of the knight placed in the corner is basically 2 squares. However, just 1 square adjacent and all of a sudden things change. You have 3 squares for the knight to move should the knight be placed on a2. If it were a3, you would have 4 different squares. And if you place the knight on a5, d5, you have 8 different squares the knight can move to. So, if you were to color the board, or if you were to create a number grid of the chessboard with the perspective of how many squares a knight can move to, what would it look like? This is exploratory chess that you want to think about. If you'd like me to do a detailed video of the perspective of knight and create the number grid for the chessboard, please share your request and thoughts in the comment. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you will look at the chessboard from the perspective of moves and perspective of how the pieces are placed given the real estate of the chessboard, and that hopefully should help you improve your game and improve your thought process behind the game of chess. Thank you so much. I shall see you in the next video.